In quiet neighborhoods, evil rarely announces itself. It hides behind familiar faces, casual greetings, and the illusion of safety. Brian and Beverly Mauck seemed to have everything: a loving marriage, a beautiful home, and a future filled with promise in the peaceful town of Graham. But before dawn on a cold November morning, that dream was shattered by a brutal act of violence that left both of them dead on their living room floor, their home transformed into a blood-soaked crime scene. At first, detectives believed they were hunting an unknown killer lurking in the shadows, until the trail of blood began to point somewhere far more terrifying, right across the street. Behind one neighbor's quiet smile lay a darkness no one could have imagined, and as investigators uncovered his past, they realized this double murder was only the beginning of a far more horrifying truth, because what they were about to find buried in his history would shock the entire town. If you are new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications. Let's start today's episode. Have you ever questioned how well you really know the people living next door? What might be hidden behind their warm smiles and casual hellos? Although there are no clear rules for spotting potentially dangerous individuals among those you know, experts in psychology and criminal investigation suggest that people with psychopathic traits are more prone to committing violent acts. If someone's behavior ever feels suspicious, it's wiser to keep your distance. This disturbing case starts with Brian and Beverly Mauck, a couple who appeared to have a picture-perfect life. They were deeply in love, financially stable, and loved traveling and spending time together. However, everything shifted after they moved into a new neighborhood. Soon after settling in, both Brian and Beverly were found dead inside their home. Blood evidence at the scene pointed investigators directly to a nearby residence. The reasons behind this brutal crime left even experienced detectives stunned. Brian and Beverly first crossed paths in the spring of 2001 at a party hosted by a mutual friend. Both were college students at the time, and from the instant they saw each other, it was obvious something special had sparked. What began as simple admiration quickly grew into a deep bond, making them nearly inseparable. That summer, they took turns visiting each other's families and introducing one another to their parents and openly expressing their serious intentions. Both families quickly supported the relationship, recognizing how well they suited each other. From a young age, Brian and Beverly had been energetic and adventurous, always drawn to sports, excitement, and new experiences, never satisfied with staying in one place for long. Beverly was a gifted athlete who stood out in baseball and track, could play the guitar effortlessly, and loved learning new languages. Her bright smile could light up any room, and she was loved by friends and peers alike. Brian, on the other hand, was drawn to more daring and unconventional sports. He had a strong passion for rock climbing, surfing, and diving, and he enjoyed taking risks. An adventurer by nature, he viewed danger not as something to fear, but as a challenge to take on. He was always prepared to face it. Each year, he aimed to visit a new destination and pick up a new skill. From their very first conversation, Brian and Beverly knew they connected deeply, sharing the same outlook. That moment marked the beginning of their intense and meaningful relationship. Together, they climbed mountains, skied and snowboarded, went scuba diving, and took on both waves and peaks. Despite their fast-moving romance and seemingly ideal relationship, they weren't eager to marry right away, choosing instead to complete their education first. After graduating, they focused on saving for a home. Brian started building his career at an industrial company, while Beverly worked as a hotel administrator, where her language skills proved highly valuable. On May 15, 2006, they officially got married in a beautiful oceanfront ceremony attended by only close family and friends. They then embarked on an extended honeymoon, traveling across several countries. Upon returning, Brian and Beverly bought a spacious house in the quiet town of Graham in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, set in a peaceful, sparsely populated area near a forest and a river. It seemed like the ideal place to begin a family and live a quiet, content life. Brian worked as an engineer at a branch of a major industrial company, while Beverly focused on translation work and chose to pursue a second degree. The couple quickly became acquainted with their neighbors and formed friendships in their new community. Sadly, their joyful and carefree life was short-lived. In a quiet neighborhood, a shocking incident unfolded on Saturday, November 17, 2007, around 8 a.m. Brian's friend Stephen arrived at their home, as they had planned to go fishing that morning. He knocked on the door but received no answer. Assuming Brian had overslept, Stephen knocked again more firmly and waited, yet the house remained silent. He then returned to his car and waited for about 30 minutes, repeatedly trying to call Brian. However, his calls were never answered. Feeling frustrated and slightly hurt that his friend might have changed plans without informing him, Stephen eventually left to go fishing alone, since he already had all his equipment. Later that day, still unable to contact Brian or Beverly, he decided to return to their house. Once again, no one responded to his knocking. This time, Stephen chose to walk around the property and peer through the windows. A sense of unease began to grow. Brian was known to be responsible and punctual, not someone who would disappear without letting anyone know. When Stephen reached the garage, he looked through a small window and noticed the couple's car was still inside. This only heightened his concern, though he tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. He then moved to the living room window and tried to look inside, but with darkness setting in and no lights on, it was difficult to see clearly. Still, what little he could make out deeply disturbed him. The television was lying face down on the floor, and just beyond it, something large and motionless was stretched across the ground. Stephen hurried back to his car, grabbed his fishing flashlight, turned it on, and aimed the beam into the living room. The sight that met him left him frozen in fear. Two bodies lay on the floor, partially covered by a blanket soaked in blood. A bare foot protruded from one side, while a hand was visible on the other. Terrified, Stephen quickly called emergency services to report what he had discovered and waited for the police to arrive, remaining outside his friend's home. When officers got there, he was the first to be questioned. He shared everything he knew about the day and expressed deep regret that he hadn't checked the windows earlier that morning when Brian and Beverly didn't respond to his knocks or calls. During the examination of the scene, investigators noted that the front door was neither locked nor forced open, which immediately raised suspicion. Inside the living room, the bodies of the homeowners were found. Both had been dead for at least 12 hours. Initial findings indicated that the cause of death was gunshot wounds from a large caliber weapon. Each victim had been shot 3 times, leaving no possibility of survival. The accuracy of the attack suggested that the perpetrator acted with clear intent and determination. But what was the reason? There were no signs of theft. Personal belongings, phones, and even cash remained untouched, eliminating robbery as a motive. There was also no evidence of a struggle, and aside from the gunshot wounds, the bodies showed no additional injuries or signs of violence. Investigators were left with the unsettling belief that this was either a carefully planned execution or a deeply personal act of revenge. However, according to those who knew them, the couple had no known enemies or ongoing disputes. Evidence showed the bodies had been moved after the crime, with blood-smeared drag marks visible across the floor. The killer had made a clumsy attempt to clean the scene, leaving behind streaks and splatters of blood on walls and furniture, revealing where the victims had been during the attack. 6 spent shell casings were also recovered at the scene. Surprisingly, the attacker did not attempt to collect the shell casings. Forensic analysis later confirmed that the shots were fired from a .22 caliber revolver. Investigators concluded that both victims were likely killed with the same weapon by a single offender. The intact lock, suggested that the couple may have willingly let the visitor into the home. Detectives theorized that Brian could have answered a knock at the door. I recognized the person and allowed them inside. It is possible he led the individual toward the living room, but as he turned away, the attacker may have drawn a firearm and fired 3 close-range shots into Brian's back. One bullet reportedly passed through his body and struck the television screen, causing it to fall to the floor. The sound of the shots may have alerted Beverly, who came out of the bedroom to find her husband lying in a pool of blood and the attacker still present. She attempted to flee, but tragically did not get far before 3 shots struck her in the back, killing her in the hallway. Her body was later dragged into the living room and placed next to Brian's. Both victims were still dressed in pajamas, indicating the attack likely occurred early in the morning while they were asleep. The reason the assailant covered the bodies with a blanket remained unclear. The cleanup effort appeared incomplete and chaotic. Drag marks across the floor suggested someone had tried to wipe away evidence, but only ended up smearing it further. A large blood stain near the bodies had also been disturbed, as if someone attempted to sweep it behind the couch. Investigators later found a plastic broom with a long handle, its bristles coated in dried blood. However, the perpetrator had carefully wiped the broom handle clean of fingerprints, which explained why it was left behind at the scene. It soon became clear why the broom had been used. The offender had been attempting to remove bloody shoe prints from the floor, scrubbing the area thoroughly. Similarly, smeared fingerprints and palm prints were found on walls, furniture, and in doctor handles, making identification extremely difficult. Despite the attacker's efforts to clean and conceal evidence, experienced forensic investigators understood that the longer a criminal remains at a scene, the higher the chance they will leave something incriminating behind. Their instincts proved correct when they examined the blanket covering the victims' bodies. There, they discovered a crucial clue, a partial boot print. The print was not immediately noticeable because it was not stained with blood. Instead, it was left in an area where only a thin layer of blood covered the surface, allowing the tread pattern to transfer onto the fabric beneath. The blanket was sent to the lab, where forensic experts identified the print as belonging to a rare model of heavy-duty work boots with a distinctive sole pattern. A further investigation showed that a construction company in Clearfield County had recently purchased several pairs of the same type of boots. Using this lead, investigators narrowed down their list of possible suspects and began interviewing employees from the company. Alongside the shoe print, detectives also recovered a palm print from one of the surfaces in the home. It appeared to be a major breakthrough, raising hopes that the case could be solved within days. However, when the print was checked against law enforcement databases, no matches were found. This suggested that the perpetrator had no prior criminal record and had never been fingerprinted by police. The first obvious suspect was Stephen, the friend who had discovered the bodies and reported the crime to law enforcement. His 2 visits to the house that day immediately drew suspicion. However, Stephen explained that he initially assumed Brian and Beverly were simply asleep earlier in the morning, which was why he did not contact the police sooner. When Stephen learned he had become a suspect, he was shocked and angered. He stated that he had spent almost the entire day fishing alone by the river in a place where no one else had seen him, leaving him without an alibi. However, investigators reviewed traffic camera footage to confirm his account. The recordings showed that he had indeed traveled to and from the fishing location as he described. Fingerprint analysis further cleared Stephen. His prints did not match any of those found at the scene, and tests for gunshot residue on his hands and clothing came back negative. In addition, Stephen had no ties to the construction company that had purchased the boots, and the size of the boot prints did not match his shoe size. With no evidence linking him to the crime, he was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. An unexpected witness emerged. Meanwhile, detectives carried out extensive interviews with neighbors in search of anyone who might have seen something. When they visited Daniel and Jennifer Tavares, who lived across the street from the Oaks, they found a valuable lead. Daniel answered the door and told them that his wife Jennifer was at work, but he was willing to answer their questions. He stated that around 5:30 a.m. on the day of the crime, he heard unusual noises coming from the Oaks home, loud sounds that he later realized were likely gunshots. Feeling both curious and cautious, Daniel looked out of his window and saw a white pickup truck parked near the house. He was certain the vehicle did not belong to the couple, especially in the moments following the loud noises. He then saw two men exit the house. The witness, Daniel Tobias, was unable to get a clear view of them due to the poor lighting. However, just before dawn, he was able to provide a more detailed description of the driver of the white pickup truck. According to Daniel, the driver was a white man in his 40s, of solid build, with long dark hair tied back in a ponytail and a mustache. He also noticed a tattoo on the man's left hand, though he could not clearly see the design. While this detail seemed promising, no other neighbors reported anything similar. Friends, family, as in co-workers of Brian and Beverly, were unable to identify anyone in their circle matching the description or driving a similar truck. In addition, the vehicle did not appear on any nearby traffic cameras, suggesting the suspects may have used back roads through the woods to avoid detection. The white pickup truck was added to a county-wide alert, but no leads came from it. A new suspect emerged during a conversation with detectives. Beverly's mother recalled that her daughter had once mentioned a neighbor, Jeremy Flint, a few months before the crime. Jeremy, a 22-year-old man, had previously been on law enforcement's radar for dealing prohibited substances. His home was known for frequent visits from suspicious individuals, and other neighbors had also spoken negatively about him. This led investigators to consider him a potential suspect in the double homicide. When officers went to Jeremy's home, he was not present, which initially raised concerns that he may have fled after the crime. Further interviews with neighbors revealed that shortly before the incident, Brian and Beverly had hosted a small gathering at their house. Jeremy, uninvited and under the influence of drugs, had reportedly arrived unexpectedly. Witnesses described his behavior as aggressive. He allegedly harassed several female guests, insulted others, and caused multiple arguments. He was eventually asked to leave, but not before threatening that the couple would regret it. The following day, Brian and Beverly noticed several items missing from their home, including a cell phone and a firearm with ammunition that had been stored in a pantry drawer. Certain that Jeremy was responsible, the couple went to confront him. They visited his home and calmly but firmly demanded the return of their belongings, warning that they would involve the police if the items were not given back. This impulsive threat, aimed at someone linked to criminal activity, may have been a serious mistake. Jeremy denied taking anything and refused to return the missing property. However, the next day, the items suddenly reappeared in the couple's backyard without explanation. Brian and Beverly believed Jeremy had left them there overnight. Although the situation seemed resolved, Beverly remained uneasy. She began to fear staying home alone and urged her husband to consider moving to a different neighborhood. When Jeremy eventually returned to town, law enforcement immediately took him in for questioning. However, it soon became clear that he had been away for nearly a week. He had returned the day after the crime, after traveling to another state to visit his parents, where he stayed for 6 days. His alibi was supported by multiple witnesses, and security footage from a bar confirmed he was out drinking with friends on the night of the incident. In addition, forensic testing showed that Jeremy's fingerprints and palm prints did not match those recovered at the scene, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. As a result, Jeremy was eliminated as a suspect. New developments in the case emerged as investigators, having exhausted their leads, to return to Daniel Tobias, the only witness, hoping he might remember something additional. During the follow-up visit, Daniel's account suddenly changed. He claimed to remember additional details about what the perpetrators were wearing and even described one of the men leaving the house, noting a scar on his cheek. This was unexpected, since he had earlier said the men's faces were hidden by hoodies. A detective then asked Daniel to indicate which window he had been looking through during the incident. When the detective examined the view, he found that even in daylight it was difficult to clearly see across the street. Given that the events had occurred in the early morning darkness, it seemed unlikely Daniel could have observed so much detail. This inconsistency raised doubts about his statement and suggested he may not have been truthful, but it also raised the question of whether he could have been involved in the crime himself. When investigators asked to see Daniel's shoes, he presented several pairs of sneakers, boots, and dress shoes, none of which matched the footprint found at the scene. Despite this, his shifting account and increasingly suspicious behavior led detectives to take a closer look at Daniel himself. A troubling background began to emerge, revealing a far more concerning history than initially known. Born in 1966 as the youngest child in a military family, Daniel's life took a dark turn at an early age when he was just 4 years old. His parents divorced, leaving him and his 3 older sisters in the care of their mother. His father remarried soon after and showed little involvement in his children from the previous marriage. By 9th grade, Daniel had dropped out of school, started running away from home, and became involved in theft and substance use. At 18, he was arrested for robbery for the first time. However, his estranged father unexpectedly stepped in and helped him avoid prison, resulting in probation instead. It appeared his father, possibly out of guilt, wanted to give him another opportunity. Despite this, Daniel continued to have repeated encounters with the law over the years, each time receiving relatively light sentences. In the late 1980s, he moved to Florida to live with his father, who tried once again to support him. His father paid for an expensive rehabilitation program at a private clinic and attempted to help him secure stable employment. However, within 6 months, Daniel was caught stealing and involved in substances again. At that point, his father gave up and sent him back to live with his mother. By then, Daniel's mental health had started to decline due to ongoing dependency issues. Within a year, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and prescribed medication. However, Daniel rarely followed his treatment as instructed. Instead, he mixed his medication with alcohol, which led to violent and unpredictable outbursts. A serious incident occurred in July 1991 during an argument with his mother when Daniel suddenly grabbed a knife and attacked her, inflicting nearly 30 wounds. She died at the scene. At trial, he claimed he had acted under the influence of voices in his head that told him to kill her. However, court-appointed psychiatrists concluded that Daniel was aware of his actions and therefore legally responsible. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Despite this, he was released on parole in 2006 after serving less than his full sentence. After his release, Daniel Tobias began corresponding with Jennifer Fritos, and the two eventually formed a romantic relationship. Jennifer waited for his release, and once he was paroled, they married. Daniel moved into her home in the small town of Graham, arriving around the same time as the couple. By relocating to another state, Daniel violated the conditions of his parole. He should have been taken into custody immediately, but a mix of police oversight and a technical error prevented that from occurring. At some point, Daniel's fingerprints were mistakenly removed from the criminal database, allowing him to avoid identification even after investigators recovered a bloody handprint at the scene. It appeared that circumstances were inexplicably working in his favor. Further inquiries also revealed that Daniel had briefly been employed by a construction company that had purchased the rare work boots connected to the case. However, detectives still lacked solid evidence to justify an arrest. They needed to carefully build their case without alerting Daniel or his possible accomplice, Jennifer. Setting a trap, on November 24, 2007, Daniel was called into the police station under the pretense of helping create composite sketches of possible suspects. He willingly agreed, and spent about an hour enthusiastically describing and assisting in drawing portraits of individuals he had entirely invented. Another officer then entered the room and casually stated that they needed Daniel's fingerprints to eliminate him as a suspect. Daniel hesitated but eventually agreed, confident that no trace of him remained at the crime scene. After the prints were taken, the officer mentioned in passing that investigators had recovered an unknown bloody handprint from the house. Daniel immediately tensed and began explaining that he had been friendly with the couple and had often visited their home, where his prints could have been left. The officer responded calmly, noting that there was no need for concern. After all, the handprint was bloody and clearly belonged to the perpetrator. A second detective then redirected the conversation to Daniel's past, bringing up the crime for which he had previously served time, leading Daniel to admit that he had killed his mother unexpectedly. He then began describing the details of that incident. Speaking with unsettling enthusiasm, he smiled as he recounted what he had done, displaying what appeared to be a disturbing lack of remorse. Meanwhile, forensic experts were comparing Daniel's fingerprints to those recovered from the crime scene. When the results confirmed a perfect match, detectives confronted him with the evidence. His confident expression immediately disappeared, replaced by anger. Before he could react further, officers restrained him and placed him under arrest. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Daniel ultimately confessed and cooperated with investigators. He explained that on the night before the crime, he had spent hours at a bar drinking and using strong substances. When he ran out of money to pay his tab, the staff threw him out and threatened to call the police. In a rage, he left the bar. Daniel Tobias then recalled that he had given his neighbor Beverly Mauck a tattoo the previous month as a friendly gesture. However, he later decided he was owed payment for the work and arbitrarily demanded $50. Armed with his revolver, he went to the Mauck home around 5 a.m., while the couple was still asleep. Brian, irritated by the early visit, answered the door and was immediately confronted with Daniel's demand for money. Confused and frustrated, Brian refused, telling Daniel to return once he had sobered up. However, Daniel persisted in trying to defuse the situation. Brian decided it would be easier to pay and went to another room to get the money. As he walked away, he made a comment that Daniel took offense to, triggering his anger in an instant. In a sudden outburst, Daniel drew his gun and fired 3 shots into Brian's back. The sound of gunfire woke Beverly, who came out to see what was happening. She found her husband lying on the floor in a pool of blood and Daniel standing over him with a gun. Realizing the danger, she tried to flee back to the bedroom, but was shot 3 times in the back before she could escape. After realizing the severity of what he had done, Daniel returned home and involved his wife, Jennifer, in helping clean up the crime scene. Disturbingly, Jennifer appeared unfazed by his actions. Together, they moved Beverly's body into the living room and placed it beside Brian's, covering both with a blanket. Jennifer reportedly suggested using a broom to remove the bloody footprints and also carefully wipe down surfaces to eliminate fingerprints. Although she missed one key handprint once the cleanup was finished, Daniel disposed of the murder weapon by throwing it into a nearby river. Despite extensive investigative efforts, the revolver was never recovered. Daniel Tobias was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jennifer expressed remorse, claiming she had assisted Daniel out of fear for her own safety. She received a 1-year prison sentence for tampering with evidence. In 2015, while renovating the property where Daniel had once lived with his mother, new homeowners made a disturbing discovery. While excavating the backyard, they uncovered human remains. Forensic testing confirmed that the remains belonged to a young neighbor who had gone missing in 1990. Investigators concluded that Daniel had developed romantic interest in her, but after she rejected him, he responded with fatal violence. He buried her body in his mother's backyard, where it stayed hidden for decades. This discovery led to Daniel receiving a second life sentence. In my opinion, This case is one of the most disturbing examples of how true horror can exist behind the mask of normalcy. What makes it especially chilling is that Brian and Beverly were not targeted because of some long-running feud or elaborate motive, but seemingly because they crossed paths with a deeply unstable and violent individual living just steps away from them. The sheer senselessness of the crime, the fact that a simple argument over money could erupt into such cold-blooded murder, makes it feel even more tragic. What stays with me most is the terrifying irony that the danger was not lurking in some dark alley or distant stranger, but right across the street, hidden behind a neighbor's ordinary appearance. It also raises unsettling questions about how many warning signs can be missed when someone with a violent past is allowed back into society without proper oversight. Above all, this case leaves a haunting sense of sorrow for a young couple whose peaceful life was stolen in the most brutal and meaningless way imaginable.